Tonight, we are very pleased to have Ches Crosbie and Ryan Orydzuk with us. Ches is a King's Counsel, and he is a retired lawyer, assuming non-practicing status with the Law Society of Newfoundland and Labrador after he had entered elected life as leader of the opposition in Newfoundland there. And he left that position in 2022. Ches has a passion for providing truthful legal information. I know that because I've worked very closely with Ches now for a couple of years. And he is all about helping injured people, help them to make informed choices about their rights. And it is an honor for me to have Ches Crosbie here tonight with us. Ryan Orydzuk is a federal occupational health and safety professional with over 15 years of experience, including extensive expertise in provincial and federal safety law and regulation. Most recently, Ryan served as a consultant supporting more than 300 Canada Post workers affected by the federal COVID-19 vaccination mandate. And I've been privy to a lot of the emails going back and forth between Ches and Ryan and Garrett. And so anyway, it's been a very fascinating thing to watch all of that. So Ches, we'll turn things over to you until Ryan can get sorted out and join us here. So over to you.
Thank you, David. So as Ryan joins us, Ryan originally testified at the National Citizens Inquiry, and he's been doing his best efforts to bring the violations of workplace health and safety represented by the vaccine mandates to general attention for some years now. Amongst other things, it cost him his job. And so I regard him as a man of great integrity and great commitment to the truth, and he's paid a price for it. So to cut to the chase, the analysis, and I put in hundreds of hours on this now. I thought from the beginning that he was onto something, but I can't say I felt I really understood it in any comprehensive or deep way until the last couple of weeks when I spent some time walking through it and being tutored by him and educated by him on it. And I think that's because for most of us, workplace health and safety is not an intuitive thing, and that I include lawyers in that. Lawyers don't often get involved at that level of occupational health and safety. It tends to be, between employees and employers, often in unionized workplaces. And lawyers, as long as there's no disputes that descend to the level of tribunals that have to make determinations, seldom get involved. And even at the level of workers' compensation boards, lawyers often don't get involved. So it's not something I think Brian Heck would agree that might come intuitively to us. So you've got to immerse yourself in this to realize that there's a dense body of laws around occupational health and safety that set up many tripwires for employers who don't follow their duties that are imposed on them to make sure that workplaces are safe. And the consequence of not following and living up to the duties to ensure the safety of substances introduced into the workplace as exposures is that they are liable for it. What I'm talking about here is not a matter of evidence, it's a matter of law. Employers all over Canada, not just in the federal workplace, although we're using Canada Post as a kind of case study, it's in virtually every workplace in Canada, affecting 20 million people were subjected to vaccine mandates. About 2 million of these people work in federally regulated industries or federal workplaces, Government of Canada, Crown corporations, and agencies. If you take the statistic that 81%, 82% of Canadians received at least one injection of the so-called COVID-19 vaccines. Then we're talking about 16 million people who receive these vaccines consequentially on vaccine mandates imposed by employers. And if we apply the study of Dr. Freeman and colleagues, and we heard, David, from Dr. Freeman as a witness at the NCI hearings, that study that he did is still regarded as foundational. And his finding was that for every 800 shots, there was a serious adverse injury rate of 1. So 1 in 800 resulted in serious adverse injury. If you do the math, that would give us would give us about 20,000 people who suffered injury in workplaces because of vaccine mandates. 20,000 people. 20,000 people is not a small number. Yet very, very few of these people have I guess, have understood that they have rights arising out of the violation of workplace health and safety laws that entitle them to make application for compensation if they think they're vaccine injured. Very few of those 20,000, very few of those complaints have come forward, as far as Ryan knows, and he's fairly well connected as a former safety officer in the Canadian safety occupational health and safety community. What we want to do here is bring the trickle of complaints and compensation claims up to flood level. We want to turn this into a tsunami, because while so far the authorities have been slow walking the complaints, finding excuses not to deal with them, simply ignoring them, running away from their responsibilities, if that trickle turns into a flood, that's going to be a lot harder for them to do. So what I'm hoping is that this seminar tonight leads to a lot of people who may be on this call or tell others about it to realize that their rights have been violated. And if they believe they've been vaccine injured, then they have an avenue and a well laid out pathway to making compensation claims from the workers' compensation system. And if enough people do this, it won't be possible for mainstream society, for politicians, for legacy media to ignore it. At some point, it will have to come to public notice. Somebody said, who studied the tulip bubble in Holland centuries ago, made a very astute observation. Men go insane in groups, but they return to their senses one by one. And we're seeing that happen now. And a large number of claims based on indubitable violation of legal rights in this setting, in the workplace setting, will add to that process of people in Canada coming back to their senses. Now, at this point, I wonder if Ryan is on the call, and yes, he is. There he is. All right, Ryan. So the way we're going to unfold this, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the initial presentation. I'm hoping to keep this to 20 minutes or 25 minutes or so. So my background is I'm a lawyer and a courtroom lawyer. And I thought the way we could do it is we'll treat Ryan as an expert witness, and I'll ask him questions and try and steer him to what I think might be the important issues. And by the way, I owe all of this education I've received on this to Ryan. He's tutored me and educated me on it. So whatever I know is due to him, plus my work out with an AI called Alter AI, which was recommended to his followers by Steve Kirsch about 2 months ago. And I must recommend Alter AI to anybody who has any interest in AI, because it's a uniquely honest and skeptical AI of any institutional orthodoxy. I find it just extremely, extremely good, and has helped me understand the background of this The only thing it doesn't do well is poetry. I did a poem for a colleague who's retiring, and it made some suggestions about changing some of it, and I had to reject it. After all, AI only does things on the basis of statistical probabilities. I don't think it really has a human type appreciation for poetry. But on lots of things, it's pretty good. So, Ryan, why don't we start? Um, any expert has to satisfy a tribunal that he or she has the requisite background knowledge and skill and experience to give opinion evidence, meaning they can make inferences from established facts that help the court to do its job in resolving disputes. So now, Ryan, just give us a quick word on your professional background that qualifies you to help us with understanding occupational health and safety law and how vaccine mandates may have violated that body of laws. And then I'll ask you to also tell us some of your personal experience from this.
Sure, no problem. Can you guys hear me okay? I apologize. I wasn't able to test this a bit earlier. You guys can hear me? Is that a
Go
no?
ahead.
All right. Ryan Orydzuk, I want to thank everybody at the Canadian Citizens Care Alliance, first of all, for giving me this opportunity to share a bit of my personal story and some of the actions the federal government took. I've been a safety professional for over 15 years. The bulk of that time was spent with Canada Post in the federally regulated sector. I have countless hours of federal health and safety education with Canada Post, and my provincial training as a health and safety administrator comes from the Alberta Construction Safety Association. I was a health and safety officer for the Edmonton Mail Processing Plant for 5 years at Canada Post, and then became the Alberta Northwest Human Resources business partner with roughly 1,300 clients across Alberta, Northern BC, and Northwest Territories. As an HRBP, I was a safety subject matter expert for my region and my entire HR team. And through this role, I was able to diversify my portfolio to include other aspects of HR, labor relations, compensation. My most recent work was as a safety consultant for roughly 250 postal workers that were unjustly placed on leave without pay for the mandatory vaccination policies. It was through this endeavor that I testified as an expert witness at the National Citizens Inquiry in April of 2023 and connected with representatives at the NCI like Michelle Ledoux-Catlin, Ches, and Dave Garrett from the Canadian Citizens Care Alliance. This has been a 5-year battle for me, spending thousands of hours preparing evidence and legal concepts and presentations. And thankfully today, Ches has taken the time to understand it, and he's going to work with me to kind of illuminate all the truths that I think a lot of people have missed over the while. The matter is very complex. There's a whole bunch of regulations, codes, acts to read, and hopefully we can break that down for you folks today so that you guys can have a clear understanding.
Yes, thanks, Ryan. And so give us your personal experience of this. When the vaccine mandates first came out, and we're talking about the year 2021, I guess the summer, when Mr. Trudeau made it known he was heading in that direction. Just tell us about your thoughts at that time and then your experience of dealing with folks. You were an employee in management at Canada Post, pretty big organization in the federal apparatus. Just tell us some of that background.
Yeah, no, at the beginning of 2021, there was a lot of changes that had already occurred at the federal workplace, a lot of processes that were put in place by the employer. I had many concerns with those particular choices that they were trying to implement as it was, but then I started to hear rumblings, of course, that there was going to be a mandatory vaccination policy that was going to be created. It was at that time that I kind of started to look into the ins and outs of mRNA and what the vaccines meant, because as a safety officer, if we were going to be implementing a policy at the workplace, I wanted to know everything about it. I wanted to know the ins and outs, how it worked, any potential dangers and hazards, because that would need to be communicated to supervisors, managers, executives, employees on the floor, union officials. I started to ask a lot of questions of my peers, all the management and executives that I worked with and I had trained for several years on safety. And I wasn't getting a lot of good answers. I was actually getting the kinds of answers that would kind of lead me to believe that there were things going on that shouldn't be taking place. It was overall this verbal discussion for the period of about 3 to 4 months. This was probably from about May of 2021 up until the point where the vaccine mandates went live, where I was talking to people in the safety department, my immediate manager, directors, everybody, and asking them questions if they knew about the ingredients, if they knew about the potential chemical exposures, the liability that was going to be involved in all of this. Sure enough, again, most people just said, Ryan, don't rock the boat. This is more of an accommodation thing that you can ask about later on, maybe even a human rights thing, yada, yada. And I sat there saying, well, no, you guys are writing this as a safety policy, so none of that really applies. Then the vaccines were officially mandated by Trudeau and the Privy Council come, I think it was October 6, 2021 officially. And it was at that point where I kind of started to put my foot down with a few people in the company, and it really started to irritate them. And I started to work on what was called my letter of informed consent, for which I submitted to the National Citizens Inquiry when I originally testified. And that letter was designed as a wake-up call for everybody at Canada Post. And it included the understanding that nobody's right to know, nobody's right to participate, and then what would be later on their right to refuse. It was all being violated because the employer was doing nothing to understand the technology that was going to be used as protection in the workplace.
Ryan, if I could stop you there for a
Yeah.
moment. I think probably everyone on this call would put a considerable value on medical autonomy and the right of informed consent. But do those things have any particular legal basis in the context of occupational health and safety law?
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, this was part of what happened, and it was kind of a little bit of, I think it was a trick that was played personally. Um, Previous to any other mandate that we saw federally or provincially, employees would always take their issues medically to their own physician, right? They would get informed consent directly from their doctor, and they would have a conversation about any medical procedure that there was. And it could be medication, it could be, chemotherapy treatment. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be a specific surgery. And then they would take potentially the recommendations of their doctor and consider it and then volunteer for that process after they receive their informed consent. But you see, because this was becoming now a workplace policy and it was a medical device or a biochemical device that was going to be used, the employers started to take that informed consent process away. And more importantly, because of that, it impacts the right to know. So once that occurs and the employer says, well, I'm going to mandate these vaccines as a piece of personal protective equipment for the environment, at that point, they need to know everything about them. And further to that, they need to disclose all hazards under the right to know. And this is all falls under Section 124 and due diligence, right? Where the employer is required to understand and know all foreseeable hazards in the workplace and then communicate that to the unions, the employees, and everybody that's involved. So, yes.
So Ryan, just let's pause there for a moment. And, we can eventually provide references to the law and other documentation. If people are interested in that, they can probably be put up on websites and the like. But are you talking now about matters of law as to what worker rights are with respect to knowing what is in a chemical substance that they are going to be exposed to in the workplace?
Yes, 100%. This is no different than dealing with benzene or dealing with any other chemical substance, WD-40, anything like that. Whatever the employer is using at the workplace that's a chemical substance, they're required to do a safety assessment on the substance. They need to understand what kind of first aid measures need to be employed if employees are exposed to it. They need to communicate this. They need to provide them safety data sheets. So yes, 100% with what you're saying there.
Okay, now you just mentioned safety data sheets. Well, situate that in the law of workplace safety.
Yeah, so safety data sheets are something that's provided to anybody that's using a substance in the workplace. And in this particular case with the vaccines, there are a whole host of chemicals that are components of the vaccines themselves or the injections. And with these chemical components, because the employer's rolling this out as a vaccine policy and using it as PPE, all those chemical safety data sheets that explain the hazards associated, the potential dangers, the warnings, first aid measures, whether even the product was properly chemically assessed for safety, they're all listed on these safety data sheets, and they're kind of the go-to for employers to create their safe work processes, the types of personal protective equipment that are used, etc., to prevent exposure to these chemical substances. But in this particular,
Ryan, where does the data on the so-called safety data sheets, where does it come from? Where does the employer assemble this from?
Yeah, it's usually typically created by the manufacturer as a requirement under law. So anytime that a manufacturer is creating a chemical substance, and in this case, a biochemical substance, they're required to provide information to anybody that's using it. And in this case, it would be the government of Canada that's purchasing these particular components and these chemicals to create a vaccine, or in this case, Pfizer, Moderna, and they would be providing it to anybody that was purchasing it, so they would be aware of said chemicals so that they could communicate that further on down the road to anybody that was using it. And in this case, it was everybody, because it was a mandate from the federal government, and I think, at least 80% of employees across Canada had taken it.
Ryan, I think most people on this call would have a concept that the mRNA injection products had an envelope and then a payload inside. Am I making sense there?
100%, and that's confirmed on Health Canada's own website. So Health Canada, what they did is they kind of broke down what they called the components of the vaccines. And components is a very interesting word to use, because they're not components, they're biochemical components. And I think that was intentionally disregarded, because if folks had to understand that these were chemicals that were going into their bodies, they would be asking for safety data sheets like they would for anything else in the workplace. And then there would be a little bit of disclosure and understanding that none of this stuff was ever supposed to be used in the human body. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, so you've got the envelope. What do we call that?
That's the nanolipid envelope, or the lipid nanoparticles.
Okay. And then you have the payload. I just called it, that would be, I guess,
the mRNA itself,
yeah,
the synthetic or modified RNA in this case.
Right. So just pausing for a moment and looking at the lipid nanoparticles, what can you say from your knowledge of the background safety information that, in your view, should have been included in the safety data sheets? What can you say about what would have been revealed had the requisite information on the lipid nanoparticles been actually set out in a safety data sheet?
Yeah, and this was made very clear by a lot of the manufacturers. And if you go to their websites and you check out the actual safety data sheet downloads, if you look at their product information inserts, they have the same kind of warnings across all of them, right? And ultimately, this has to do with SM102, ALC0315, ALC0159, which are the primary lipids that were being used in these mRNA vaccines.
Okay, now you just sort of gave us a payload of abstract numbers there. What are those referring to?
Those are referring specifically to the lipid coatings that go around the mRNA itself, or the modified mRNA. They're what allow it to penetrate the cell so that the mRNA can transcribe into the cell and create the spike protein. So that's the lipid coating itself. All right.
Okay, so when we say SM-102, for example, what's that mean?
That's the product identifying name. So that's the specific identifier that's listed on the safety data sheet, and that coincides directly with Health Canada's breakdown of the mRNA components on the vaccines.
So, I mean, where does it come from? There's this fancy label, SM-102. Who's putting that on it?
It's the manufacturers. So they would give the products a title and a product name, and that product name is unique to that specific chemical compound and composition.
Is that contained in an official database?
It is in the U.S. federal databases. I'll quickly mention that you and I did a little bit of a search, and for some reason, all these chemicals don't exist in any Canadian database for some odd reason.
So where would an employer go if they were doing their due diligence and including this particular product that, has this label SM102? Where would they go for the information that they ought to put in their safety data sheet?
Yeah, no, it's they would have to if they the manufacturers themselves or whoever's supplying the actual chemical compounds, they're the ones that transmit the information by law to the government of Canada, Health Canada, and the employer themselves. If they weren't given that information, which isn't true because they already have it listed as the components of the mRNA, so Health Canada has been made fully aware of this. If they somehow weren't given it, then that would be a violation on the person providing the actual chemicals themselves or the manufacturer, right? Or they wouldn't be able to give it to somebody that was using it or the purchaser on their end.
So what, in your opinion, would the safety data sheet have had to disclose about the safety or otherwise, or the human use or otherwise of these lipid envelopes that, you mentioned their official, designations? What would have to have been said about them?
Anything that was potentially hazardous that could be transmitted to anybody using the substance itself or handling the substance itself. In this particular case, in Section 1, one of the big glaring warnings across the majority of these data sheets, as well as some of the other chemical products that are in the mRNA vaccines, is that the chemicals themselves were not for human or animal use. They were for research purposes only and for people in labs so that they could do testing and understand how it would work in vitro. So,
Okay, just pause there for a second. You said not for human use.
yes, or
And
animal use.
where does that come from?
That comes directly from the manufacturer themselves.
And the manufacturer, and we're talking about the lipids here now, says not for human use?
Yes, correct. That's a big statement that they make on every single their landing web page, where they're selling the product, on the SDSs, and on their product information brochures.
Is there information about safety, hazardousness, or danger anywhere, and what would have to be said about those categories?
Yeah, so every chemical substance is kind of graded on its potential severity or acute toxicity or chronic toxicity, depending on if it's been tested. It's defined in what they call the signal word on the SDS sheet itself. And if a product is non-hazardous, they won't include a signal word. But if there is a potential small amount of acute toxicity or even moderate toxicity, they will let the user know by the signal word warning. If it's severe and there's potential severe dangers or consequences, they will use the word literally danger on the safety data sheet.
And what about that word danger you just mentioned? Would that have to appear in the safety data sheets for these lipid nanoparticles?
According to the manufacturers and many of the providers, that word was used as it coincided with SM102. Same with ALC0315. So these were all recognized as potentially hazardous. And I mean, if you look at the function and the combination of these particles with the mRNA itself, they are completely cardiotoxic and immunotoxic as well to the body.
Okay, so just let's recap that for a moment there. The safety data sheet, in your view, would have to disclose that the product, and we're just talking about the lipids now, was not for human use.
Correct.
And would it have fallen into a category of danger?
Yes. Obviously, because if it's not supposed to be used in humans or animals, that already is kind of signifying that there's concerns with the chemical itself or the biochemical in this case.
Now, can you say a word about the contents? That's the mRNA.
Yeah, a little bit for sure. And I'll just quickly touch on the safety data sheet. There is a section at the end of these safety data sheets as well, and it's a section 15. And just as a little bit of a heads up to everybody, a lot of the safety data sheets do mention that SM102, ALC0315, and ALC0159 they were not chemically assessed for safety, and that's according to the manufacturers themselves. And I imagine that lends a little credence to why they're not supposed to be used in humans or animals, because they really haven't done a test and they don't really know how it's going to do, what it's going to do to the body, right? When it comes to, sorry, what was your question there, Dave? You were saying, or
Yeah, what can you tell us about, relative to the idea of not for human use or the concept of danger as it applies to occupational health and safety about the actual payload?
Yeah, no, the mRNA itself. So Um, that's something that was a bit of a, I guess you can say, a little bit of a lie from Health Canada in the way that they had presented this, because a lot of employees, if they wanted any information, the employer wasn't giving it to them, and the employer didn't seem to have a clue as to how anything worked, how the mRNA functioned, anything like that. But they were calling it messenger RNA on their website, and they were kind of making it sound like regular viral RNA that would interact with your cells in a normal way. However, this was modified RNA, and that was another chemical that was added to the compound that wasn't disclosed, which is pseudouridine. And pseudouridine, when it's added to this mRNA, what it does is when the spike protein is created through transcription, it ends up making it a very tough protein to degrade. And from all the studies that are showing, there's production that continues on, right? So what ends up happening is the mRNA itself is creating the very hazard that they were claiming to protect against, which is the spike
Okay,
protein.
we might all agree with that, but just keeping the focus on occupational health and safety and what should have been disclosed on safety data sheets. What should have
Yeah.
been disclosed?
Well, that's the thing, is there is no safety data sheet on the specific mRNA. As far as I can find, that's like a synthetic compound that the pharmaceutical companies were using. But because it's a component of the actual lipids, because it goes inside of the lipid, and that's kind of how it all functions as one unit, um, both components act as a toxin to the body. The lipids cause inflammation to the body, and then the mRNA itself creates the spike protein in the body, which adds to more problems and issues for the person that's taken it. But there's
Okay,
very little data
just
on that.
pause there for a second, Ryan. You've explained to us that the manufacturers provide information that should have been placed in the safety data sheets. For example, not for human use. Is there comparable manufacturers information for the mRNA?
Not that I've been able to find, because I think that they're hiding a little bit of that data under, I think, privacy clauses or rights like that were given to them when they were selling the product to the Canadian government. I can't confirm
So
that
what
100% though.
What, in your view, ought an employer have done when confronted with the situation that, well, yeah, there's information on the lipid part of this product, and it's not for human use. What would an employer have to put in a safety data sheet about the contents, the mRNA?
They don't have to put anything physically in the data sheets themselves. Those are given to them directly from the manufacturers. They would have to communicate all of those hazards and provide that disclosure to all the employees, though, as a condition of employment, because they're asking them to use it as personal protective equipment in the workplace. So,
But wait now, you're saying there's scant information from manufacturers or maybe no information about the mRNA, is that right?
yes,
So what would go in the safety data sheet?
for that specific, I don't know if they would classify it as a chemical compound. I'm assuming they would, a biochemical compound, but given what it's targeting and the fact that it's integrating with the human genome, there would be massive warnings as far as I'm concerned.
Well,
It's
some of that may be in retrospect, but I'm just wondering at the time if we just turn our time machine back to, 2021.
Yeah, no, it would, to me, given that there was no testing done, no proper assessment on the chemical composition, both would be considered dangerous because there was no understanding as to what it would do. And I mean, there was very little testing that was done previous to the application of mRNA and the nanolipids. And further to that, there were ongoing studies the whole time while it was being rolled out where they were trying to gain an understanding and grasp of it. So to me, it should have never have been used. And if people wanted to exercise their right to use those substances, it should have never been made a workplace policy or a mandatory one for that. It should have just remained a personal choice between a client and their physician, really, like any other medical product or medical decision.
So how was it presented in the workplace? The product, the mRNA enclosed in a lipid nanoparticle, how was it presented as protective or otherwise for workers?
Yeah, and that's the thing is it was basically right from the prime minister's own mouth, and the second that he announced the mandatory vaccination policy on October 6th. Right in his first statement to Canada, he said, you know, we're going to be making this mandatory vaccination policy for all federal workers. This is to protect against the virus COVID-19. Um, that in itself is identifying the fact that it's a safety policy more than anything else, and that they're using it as a protective measure against the hazard that they were, you know, worried about floating around as an invisible asymptomatic hazard in the workplace, right? So they were using it as a weak form of protection, because again, personal protective equipment is the lowest form of protection for employees. The best thing the employer could have done if they were concerned about COVID-19 would have been to literally shut the facilities down for 2 weeks and let the virus disappear, or let everybody run its course or whatever, and then reopen them, because that would be eliminating the hazard and the potential exposure altogether with. But
So
they
the
were using it as
injectable
PPE.
products, Ryan, how were they categorized for purposes of mandating the uptake in workplaces? What were they labeled as?
They weren't labeled as anything because the employer tried to say it wasn't their liability. But
No, but I mean, it had some label on it to make it acceptable to people. What was the label?
uh, well, they were trying to distinguish it as personal protective equipment.
Yeah, okay. So personal protective equipment. So this is what they're calling an injection, personal
Yes.
protective equipment.
Yeah.
Why would they do that?
Because you know what? I don't know the reasons for it. They claim that they needed to further the protection of employees in the workplace, because there were, you know, cases and maybe employees were getting sick from COVID-19. But the bottom line is that they couldn't use it as a piece of personal protective equipment in any way, shape, and form. It created the very hazard that the employer was claiming that they needed protection against. And when it comes to occupational regulations and safety law, protective equipment cannot, by definition, create a hazard for the employee when they're using it. And this was creating the spike protein, which is a hazard. The lipids themselves were an inflammatory hazard. There's all sorts of side effects that are being recorded: cancer, heart attack, stroke. These are all literal life-ending hazards, right? So to call it personal protective equipment is a ridiculous statement, and just criminal on its face.
Yet that's what they did call it.
Yeah,
The injections were called or categorized as personal protective equipment.
they would deny that for sure. They would say, "Oh, no, no, it wasn't. This isn't our liability." But unfortunately, when you look at all the workers'
No, no, I'm not
compensation,
talking about liability now. That's
yeah,
not the question. It's how it was labeled, how it was categorized.
yeah. Well, they weren't categorizing it as theirs. They were trying to say it was our decision and that it was still your decision between your physician. But because they wrote a safety policy for it, saying we needed to protect people against SARS-CoV-2, it became personal protective equipment in the workplace instantly the second they did it.
Okay. So is there a pathway, and we'll sort of wind this up now and bring it to a conclusion, is there, in your view, a pathway for people who believe that they were um, injured by vaccine mandates, workers who are injured by vaccine mandates? Is there a pathway to make workers' compensation claims as a result of that?
I certainly think so. I think there is a pathway for both workers' compensation and potentially criminal charges down the road, to be honest. First thing that people would want to do is to make sure that they download all the information. So download all the safety data sheets. And uh, what it's called the internal complaint resolution process. And this is similar across federal and provincial sectors. This process allows employees to bring known hazards to their immediate supervisor's attention, and they are supposed to do an investigation with the employees as to whether or not these hazards exist. In this particular case, because they're already known hazards and they're already recognized as hazards, this would just be a matter of the employer having to disclose this now to all employees, because if they've already created the mandatory policy and they didn't do this at the beginning, once the employees bring this stuff forward, it's up to them to now disclose this under law and to let everybody know of these potential concerns. So that would be the first step, is to engage with your supervisor at the first level. It would be an investigation. You would fill out your workplace hazard report. Every employer might have a different version of what this looks like. You can download one off the Canadian government's website if you need to. But ultimately, you would fill it out. You would formalize the complaint, the concern, and the hazards that you're seeing. And you would provide your safety data sheets, any relevant information that you want to show the employer your concerns. And then you would provide it to your supervisor at a first level. The supervisor would sit
Okay,
down.
Ryan, I think for the sake of expediting, we can provide a decision tree or a step sheet, which could be posted up for those folks who might want to see what we suggest as being a pathway towards making a compensation claim. Because it has its own unique requirements, but in your opinion, would vaccine injury as a result of workplace mandates be classified in such a way as compensable by workers' compensation?
Yes, just like any other chemical exposure in the workplace. And I mean, there's tons of cases of benzene exposure, asbestos exposure, that it's all the same kind of bag of worms, as they say. There's no difference. The employer, once they kind of have this stuff, and once WCB receives this information, to me, I don't think it's a very hard case for WCB to accept. And given that this was never disclosed to anyone by any employer across Canada, I do think it's all very pertinent and new information that would re-engage WCB as well as the Labor Board for having claims compensated and for investigations to begin across Canada.
Okay, Ryan, I'm going to thank you for your evidence up till now. And of course, we have time for questions, and imagine people will have questions. But I'd ask Garrett, if you're there, Garrett, to at this point put on that short video clip from the master mandator himself, who was questioned by a dogged reporter in Davos, I think probably yesterday. Let's have a quick look at that, and there's a point I want to make about it.
Human rights of those who didn't want to get vaccinated. Yet some people have died as a result of this. Is that really a smirking matter?
Why you pushed Canada to vaccinate the
pushing
people?
disinformation the way you have?
What is disinformation?
Irresponsible.
What, that people
Why you
have
pushed
died?
people in Canada to vaccinate
I'm sorry, but
the COVID vaccine.
but that's not misinformation. My old cameraman's
They
mother
wanted
actually.
freedom, and you pushed.
Okay, thank you very much. So the reason I thought we might have a look at that, it's quite recent, but if you could pick out what Mr. Trudeau said to the reporter, when the reporter mentioned deaths from the vaccine products, he said that you're spreading disinformation, which is a propaganda term, and being irresponsible. So the point I simply wanted to make is if we can turn the trickle of workers' compensation claims and complaints that is occurring in Canada right now into a flood or even a tsunami, then it becomes harder and harder for people like the former Prime Minister to label this as disinformation, because he will then be faced with binding findings of fact and law by an array of tribunals across the country. And so that's why it's Ryan's and my hope that people will take up making complaints and compensation claims in abundance. There's about 20,000 folks out there, probably, who suffered serious adverse injury as a result of these vaccine mandates. And if a significant portion of those people realize they have legal rights and then act on them, then that will be a potent agent for change in this country. Thank you.